En el episodio número 13 del podcast estuve conversando con el antropólogo Wade Davis. Estuve sentado con él en la biblioteca del Gimnasio Moderno hablando de su fascinación por este país que es inspiradora y mágica. Su libro El Río se está reeditando por cuarta vez y tomamos eso como punto de partida para hablar de paz, de viajes, de coca, de peyote, de cocaína, del fracaso de la guerra contra la droga, del profundo sueño de paz que lo invade con respecto a Colombia, de su temor a la desaparición de saberes ancestrales y de lenguajes que construyen también la diversidad de la que es esta locura llamada Colombia y que es un modelo ejemplar de fertilidad, pluralidad y vida. Aún tengo la boca abierta de oírlo hablar. En el episodio número 13 del podcast, Wade Davis, por Canal 13. Thank you for being here, for accepting the invitation to the podcast, and for being in the celebration of the Filbo in the event of our bicentenary. It's great to have you here, and I guess the very first question that I would approach you with has a lot to do with being a Colombian citizen, what it means to you, what it is to be a Canadian and to see our country now as a citizen, but also after all the trips and travels.
Well, you know, it's interesting because my first exposure to travel was the first time I came to Colombia. And I think you, as a traveler, often fall in love with the first place that allows you to be free. And when I was growing up, I was in a very modest family in Canada. But my mother in 1968 said that Spanish was the language of the future. And she worked all year in a very modest job to raise him money to allow me to go with a group of students with a teacher to Cali for the summer. Now, at that time, in 1968, the vast majority of the world had never been in an airplane, so the South American destination was very exotic. And I was 14, the other boys were 16 and 17. They were mostly with wealthy families in the Club Campestre in Cali.
Yeah.
Y yo fui con una familia más modesto en Dapa. And so for 12 weeks, I never saw the other Canadians, many of whom se cayó con mamitis.
Sí.
Y yo, al contrario, I felt like I'd finally found home. And
Why? What was it about it?
Because, well, first of all, I got drunk here for the first time.
Okay.
I kissed my first girl here for the first time. That es suficiente. Pero no, es que, en serio, es que one day I was at a cabalgato, and I found myself dancing with the mother of my girlfriend. That doesn't happen in Canada. And there was something about the intensity of the Latin spirit, the acceptance of the fragility of the human spirit, the sense that life felt real, visceral, and it was just something that just captured my imagination. And then I returned. I actually was 20 years old and at university, and tired of just reading about Native people, indigenous people in books. And I was in a cafe in Harvard Square, and there was a National Geographic map of the world right beside me. And my best friend looked at the map, and he looked at me, and he looked at the map, and he pointed to the high Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere, and I watched as my left arm lifted, and it hit the Colombian Amazon. Now, if it had landed in Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar.
Yeah.
But having decided to go to Colombia, there was only one man to see, the legendary Amazonian explorer, the man who sparked the psychedelic era, Richard Evans Schultes, the greatest explorer of the 20th century. And I didn't know much about him. I didn't understand what an Anglophile he was. It was said of him that the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London.
Yeah.
And I knocked on his fourth floor door in the Botanical Museum, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British Columbia." Now, the British caught his attention But the Colombia is what really, he thought I was talking about his beloved Colombia because he had made his life in Colombia. He had been here from 1941 to 53, all the time in the Amazon, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the glory of the rainforest. So I told him I'd saved up money in a logging camp and I wanted to go to the Amazon like you did and collect plants. Now, he didn't ask me what courses I had taken, what my credentials were, and said, well, son, when do you want to go? And 2 weeks later, I landed at El Dorado with no plans, a one-way ticket, only a promise never to go back to North America until Richard Nixon was no longer president. And that happened. And I just followed my heart. And this is what, in my new book that's coming out next year, Magdalena, I write in the preface about how, I traveled everywhere in Colombia and was always embraced in a world of wonder by the people. I always speak of Colombia as a país de colores y cariño. It's like there's just an intensity here that is so attractive and so seductive and so wondrous. And that came into me like a virus, and it never left. And so it was actually very emotional the day I was asked by President Santos if I wanted to become a Colombian citizen. And I think I actually started to cry. I was weeping because you can't control what country you're born into, but you can control the country that you will devote your life to. And I think the reason that President Santos was so kind and generous was really because of this book, El Rio, the impact that it had. I mean, it's fascinating. Professor Scholte's best student was my closest friend, Tim Plowman, and Tim was the finest and the kindest man, but the finest botanist of his generation, and he tragically died of AIDS, SIDA, in about 1987. He was that first generation of gay guy. And I was giving the eulogy at his funeral, and Professor Scholtes was too sick to attend, and so he sent a tape that ended in those beautiful words from Hamlet, "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." And everybody was weeping in the hall, and I was weeping. And I said, I'm going to tell a story about these two men so that they will never be forgotten. And so I wrote the book El Rio in 6 years. And when it came out in a Spanish edition, it's not really my book anymore. It's the book of Nicolas Sescuan, this incredible Colombian poet who set his own life aside to bring this book, One River, alive in his language in a way that is both utterly loyal to the original text, but absolutely uniquely his. And that book came out in 2002 at a time when there was not a decent word being said about Colombia. And suddenly there appeared this 600-page love letter to the nation. And I think the book was well received. It's so funny. It came out con solamente 500 ejemplos, no? And I'd forgotten about it, and I was traveling all around the world for the National Geographic, and I came back to Santa Marta in 2008, and I saw this hippie girl on the beach reading this frayed copy of an edition I didn't know existed. And then I went to interview Rafael Pardo, and he had a perfect edition on his desk in his office in Bogota, in his home. And I thought, well, something's happening here. And the book had taken on a life of its own because I think it served for young people in particular as a map of dreams. It was an account of a time when a young person was free to travel anywhere his or her feet could take them in this wonderful country. And suddenly this cruel war, fueled exclusively by the consumption of cocaine abroad, forced every Colombian to almost turn their back on their own nation.
That's interesting because as you approach citizenship and as you become a citizen, I also wonder, and I think about me being a Colombian citizen, what it means to me right now and what it means to you, and how, in spite of our origins, this country connects us in such a magic and mystical way.
I wouldn't go too far, but in a way, I felt it was an act of solidarity. I was so sick of the way that Colombia was being reduced to caricature. It's amazing. If you think of the war, at no point were there more than 200,000 combatants in a nation of 48 million. The vast majority of Colombians were victims of the violence. The violence would not have lasted a week without cocaine. Yeah. And the entire cocaine market is driven by consumption. So those who really have the blood of innocent Colombians on their hands are everyone you know who uses the illicit substance, and every country that creates a market by prohibiting its use but doing nothing to really curtail the use. Yeah. And yet, despite all of that complexity, Colombia has maintained civil society and democracy, greened its economy, had positive economic growth, created millions of acres of national parks, sought restitution with indigenous people in a way that cannot be matched by any nation state in the world, and has paved the way for what will be a cultural, economic, and spiritual renaissance as two generations of Colombians come back to the nation from the capitals of all the world, having been educated and trained in every conceivable vocation. So Colombia is on the edge of an extraordinary explosion of creative potential.
Would legalization solve it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the only thing that will, the problem is the only thing that will sweep clean the criminality is legalization. And everybody says, oh, wouldn't that be dangerous? I mean, every country in the world that has legalized drugs has seen a precipitous drop in both crime and consumption. There's no one you have ever met, and I was part of the drug subculture. Our museum at Harvard was a world center for the study of drugs. You'll never meet anybody whose decision to use or not use drugs has anything to do with their legal status, right? And you could legalize drugs today, and I think you'd only see, for the most part, benefits. And the whole question is, the consequences of legalization or the empowerment of the cartels, the mafia, the black market, and the cost of that to the nation are so much greater than the potential threat of legalization. So I'm in favor of the legalization of all drugs.
Why does El Rio become this viral sensation at the beginning of the millennium? What is it about it?
Well, as I was saying, I think one of the things we never talk about and the consequences of the whole, not just the conflict, but the whole drug phenomena, is that Colombians became pariah, almost a pariah nation. I mean, totally. A very close friend of mine, Carolina Barco, who was, daughter of the president, Virgilio Barco, foreign minister, one-time minister of external affairs, ambassador of Colombia in Washington, D.C. And she was going through Dulles Airport, and a security guard began to frisk her, and he totally ignored her claims of diplomatic privilege. Well, if that can happen to Colombia's highest diplomatic official, what happens to an ordinary Colombian family when they travel around the world? I have so many Colombian friends who were forced to flee. Now think about this. 1 in 5 Colombians were forced to flee their country. Now if Canada, for example, had patterns of drug production, distribution, and an illicit market that forced 65 million Americans to have to flee their homes, because that's the proportionally
how it would go. Yeah.
Maybe the Americans would think twice about their so-called war on drugs, which has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, unmeasurable amounts of treasure.
Is it political or industrial?
It's really political. One of the funny things is the Americans spend roughly $57 billion a year on the war on drugs, and yet 50 years after the beginning of that ill-conceived crusade, there are more people using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before. The problem is the entire apparatus of the U.S. government has a piece of that pie, and none of them want to give that up. So it's become this ideological engine. The only benefit of the conflict was that huge areas of the country were essentially off limits for industrial development. And so when you think, by contrast, with Ecuador, that in the 1970s made major decisions about colonization, pipelines, oil extraction in the Oriente, Colombia was not able to do that. So now the decisions the country will make will be informed by 50 years of appreciation of the importance of biodiversity, of the importance of of indigenous people that simply didn't exist 50 years ago. So it represents an incredible opportunity never before experienced by a nation state, and a nation state that has led the world in all of the above.
Yeah.
National parks, protection, respect for the indigenous people. Look what happened with Virgilio Barco in the 1980s with Martin von Hildebrand, head of Indian Affairs.
Yeah.
The president says to this young anthropologist, Martin, do something for the Indians, as he put it. In 5 extraordinary years, Martin did more than something. He secured legal protected status for an area collectively the size of the United Kingdom for the 57 ethnicities of the Northwest Amazon. And then behind a barrier of isolation created by the troubles of modern Colombia, a whole new dream of culture was reborn.
How endangered is biodiversity, indigenous culture, language, by globalization?
Well, it's really this in the hidden backdrop of our age. Alejandro, when you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, language isn't just a body of vocabulary or set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of every culture comes into the world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, which means we're living through an era where, by definition, half of humanity's knowledge is at risk. And there are many people who say, well, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Especially Americans tend to say that. And my response to this, what a wonderful idea, but let's make that universal language. Let's make it Haida, Yoruba, Arawako, whatever, Ika. Suddenly you begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry. But that dreadful fate is the plight of somebody every 2 weeks, because on average, every fortnight, some elder passes away and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. It is scary. And of course, the critical thing is that the same force that is, impacting cultural diversity is impacting biological diversity. We have this idea with culture that these societies are quaint and colorful but destined to fade away, failed attempts at being modern. Nothing could be further from the truth. In every case, these are dynamic peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that's an optimistic observation, because if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And the amazing thing about Colombia, Colombia, there's so many challenges. Obviously, one of them in the wake of peace is the fact that vast areas that may have the protection of the law on paper don't have the protection of the law on the ground. And so we've seen an incredible surge of deforestation alrededor de Chiripiquete, por ejemplo. And that is a severe threat to the stability of the natural systems of Colombia, of course. But that said, it's also kind of astonishing that you have in Colombia so many indigenous voices still speaking their truth.
How do you preserve them?
Well, you don't preserve them. The whole question is not about preservation. It's how do we find ways that all peoples of the world can benefit from the genius of the modern, but without that engagement demanding the death of who they are as a people. The real purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. Anthropology exists as the antidote to Donald Trump. The point of anthropology is to say the obvious, that every culture's got something to say, each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. We have this idea, the curse of humanity is sort of cultural myopia, the idea that my world's the real world and your failed attempt to be me.
Totally.
Now, it's not just Americans and others.
It's all over the place.
Yeah, it's all over. The word barbarian in English comes from the Greek word barbarous. If you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. And so the whole thing is not how we preserve anything, but how do we find a way to move forward together so that all the voices of humanity have a place at the table of human wisdom. Every single culture is by definition a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the cultures of the world answer that question, they do so in all these different voices.
Why are we going back to this conversation of polarization? As an anthropologist, and as the mission of anthropology you've stated continues to be important and meaningful, Why is it that we're making the same mistakes all over again?
Well, it's like when Lord Krishna was asked by a disciple, why is there evil in the universe? And he said, to thicken the plot. In other words, evil walks, and it's never defeated. The Christian tradition has this very strong sense that if we just work hard enough, good will triumph over evil. Well, that's not what the Buddhists or the Eastern, it's more of a sense of, to think you can change the world makes you both wrong and dangerous, but you have an obligation to bear witness to the world and do your bit. What side are you going to be on? And I was talking with Martin von Hildebrand, and we just made this wonderful film in Apopores and Chiribiquete for Caracol. And I just saw a screening of it last night, and there's this really sweet thing that Martin and I have been friends for almost over 45 years. And you see this film with these two old codgers still stumbling around the jungle, still trying to help, still try to hang out, and still have fun, mambiando todas las noches y todo eso. And it's like, one of the reasons we can keep going and be so optimistic is because we don't really expect in the end to win anything. It's more like, how are you going to live your life? And I think it's a really important lesson for young people. Yeah. Pessimism is an indulgence. Despair is an insult to the imagination. Orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. When you're young, you want to just do what you need to do and then seek permission, and then ask whether it was possible. If you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space.
Can you change the world?
No,
can it happen?
Well, you can.
Can you change it for better, I guess?
Yeah, that's the hope. You bend your shoulder to the wheel of history. I like to think that the wheel of history, the wheel of history bends towards righteousness. I like to believe that. And at the same time, I have no expectation that I will ever live to see a righteous world. But on the other hand, my dad used to say this. He was such a simple guy, but he'd just say, son, there's good and evil in the world. Take your pick and live with it,
Yeah. You said something to Sandra, you wrote something to Sandra that really amazed me. You wrote an email to her.
I know what she's done. She's tricked me.
I'm gonna go ahead and read it out loud because I think it's one of the most beautiful things I've read in my life. It says, I do long for the air of Bogota, that unmistakable scent that tells me I've landed on the savannah. It's hard to explain. When I talk about loving Colombia, it's something visceral, even sensual. To be away for too long is to be on life support. To step again onto the soil of the nation is to feel instantly that very sense of belonging that so long ago gave me the freedom to envision the man I've become. Whispered messages of a landscape unlike any other. The wild embrace of a people that allowed a vagabond boy to grow into a content and realized scholar. It is the very madness of Colombia that rescued me. Like a sweet coefficient of the soul. My fire was so bright, so all-consuming, that I came very close to self-immolation. Only Colombia could match and give purpose to my passion. I was saved by that, and this is the key if anyone wants to understand my loyalty to the country. I guess that pretty much explains a lot,
That could have been one too many glasses of wine, and I am Irish. But the thing is, Sandra Uribe es como mi colega y trabajamos en todos los proyectos juntos y estamos en contacto casi todos los días, varias veces, ¿no? But I don't know. I think we just got exhausted one day, and it was sort of like, are we going to really get these things done and everything? And I just said, send her that, to remind her of what I feel this is all about.
In 5 minutes. 5 minutos.
You sent me an email, and then 5 minutes later you sent me this when I was like,
It gives you hope. It's one of the things that really bewilder me and underwhelm me about being a Colombian is our lack of love for who we are. And yet here you are, giving us this example of what it means to be a Colombian?
Well, I think it's not just Colombians. I mean, I'm Canadian, and we live next door to the United States, which, if there's one thing about the United States, self-doubt is not one of their national characteristics. And
Not at all.
And Canadians are totally the opposite. You can't imagine a Canadian politician wrapping themselves in the flag. We didn't even have one until 1965. The perfect expression of our patriotism is a line of verse by a great Franco-Canadian poet who wrote, "Mon pays, ce n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver." My country is not a country, it's the winter, And we live in this landscape where the way to the north hovers in our imagination. For most of our history, there were more lakes in Canada than people. There's a funny thing, if you ever bump into a Canadian, the Canadian always says, "I'm sorry." And there was this famous British travel writer, Jan Morris, who said that in Vancouver you could drown in niceness. In Canada, the phrase "I'm sorry" is not an apology, it's a mantra. And it says, look, you and I live in this impossibly big country where the winters are so cold, we get along with each other. We're a country of conciliance and cooperation and kindness. And you didn't want to bump into me, I didn't want to be whacked by you. And so I'm sorry, but you're actually apologizing that the event happened. You're not apologizing to the person, right? Americans never get that. And you say that about Colombia, but why not? I mean, think about it. One thing that's never talked about in terms of the war, the conflict, the cartels and everything, is that for 2 generations, Colombians were made to feel ashamed of themselves.
Absolutely.
We talk about the psychological impact of the war on victims, on individuals, on families, perhaps on communities. But what about a whole kind of psychological scarring of a nation? Sandra, for example, forced to move to Miami as a teenager.
Yeah, I did. So did I.
Like
I had
so
to
many,
move too.
And she'd go to school, and in Miami, the American school children would make fun of her for being from the city of Escobar when their main social activity at night was to try to find drugs, illegal cocaine being their favorite.
Yep.
A young paisa who had never seen cocaine in her life, never used cocaine in her life, had no intentions of using cocaine in her life. I mean, one of the things that is really interesting is years ago, we made a film here in Colombia, and I interviewed Alfredo Malano, and I'll be with him tonight. And Alfredo was we were talking about the origin of the whole drug thing in Colombia, and he referred to el tiempo del cuerpo de paz. And he didn't mean the Cuerpo de Paz started the drug trade, that era when all the gringos came. But the truth is the Cuerpo de Paz was up to their necks in the drug trade. So were the Americans. It was American Vietnam vets who taught the Colombians to fly drugs to Miami and to Florida, Bahamas, and so on. And so we made this film, and we aired it at the National Geographic, unfortunately, on the 60th anniversary of the American Peace Corps in Colombia. And so, believe me, I got into trouble. And I was taken to the head of the whole National Geographic. What is this nonsense that Americans had anything to do with the beginning of the war on drugs? I said, what are you talking about? That's exactly what happened. And how do you know? What's your source? I'm your bloody source. I was there. I was living in Medellin in 1973. And I explained, and they're just blind to the fact that the agony caused to Colombia was not really the fault of Colombia. In 1973, I never knew, I always hated cocaine. I always loved coca, leaf. Es dos cosas totalmente distintas. Es como la papa y vodka, I could even tell another story. We did the first nutritional study of coca. The efforts to eradicate coca began 50 years before there was a cocaine problem. And
why?
Because physicians in Lima, Peru, looked up in the Andes, and they saw poor sanitation, illiteracy, hunger, and the efforts to eradicate the fields had nothing to do with the pharmacology of cocaine hydrochloride and everything to do with the cultural identity of those who revered the plant. And no one, through all those years, bothered to do a nutritional study of coca, which we did in 1975, and what we discovered horrified our backers at the US government. Coca turned out to have a tiny amount of the alkaloid, absorbed benignly in the mucous membrane of the mouth, no more toxic than tea or coffee or mate or cualquier cosa. It also had more vitamins than you can imagine. In fact, your daily dose of hayo for the Arhuaco men satisfies all the daily dose of vitamins required. It has more calcium than any other plant known, which made it perfect in a diet that lacked a dairy product, in the high Andes in particular. It even had enzymes which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation. So in one single assay, we put into stark profile these horrific efforts to eradicate traditional fields of a plant that had been used for 4,000 years with no sign of addiction, let alone toxicity. And when our results came out, Timoteo, my friend, said, there's a job at USDA I want you to apply for, but if you take it, I'll kill you.
What was it?
Well, I went out to see this guy. He clearly was DEA, not USDA.
Okay.
And I walked into his office, and the first thing I noticed, he was a drug addict. He was smoking all the time. And his walls were surrounded with seized paraphernalia. And he had all these golden chains around his necks and these gold things here. And I painted, where have I seen you before? I kept thinking, And it suddenly dawned on me, I hadn't seen him before, but he was the cartel.
He was both a dealer and a user?
No, the dealers and those who want to destroy the trade, they're the same people. Not literally, but none of those people want to win the war on drugs. They'd be out of work.
Of course.
No, they want to keep it going. And there's so much money involved on both sides. And the cartels don't want drugs legalized. The DEA doesn't want drugs legalized because then they're all out of, the game's over. Yeah,
out of a job.
Right? And so what this guy wanted me to do, this was a job description, all they had found in all our research was that we were really good at finding coca fields. So he wanted me to go to Peru, into the coca fields,
find them,
get the insect pests that they were going to then mutate to purposefully reinfect the fields of Latin America. And
how'd you get out of it?
Well, I just didn't take the job. But
okay.
it's really interesting. If you think about it, Colombia has dealt with the consequences of the obsession of a country like the United States, whose own societal failures lead its own peoples to seek happiness momentarily in a drug that is best used as an anesthetic to dull and eliminate the senses. And my feeling is that for Colombia to absorb the consequences of defoliating its forest, the impact on biodiversity, impact on children's health, in order to satisfy the needs of a country that just is suffering from this plague of its own creation.
And now that you mention it, isn't this monster mutating into, and maybe looking at it from a devil's advocate point of view, but also taking into consideration that it's still going to damage a lot of people and hurt a lot of people? Isn't this drug trade monster turning into a big business for big pharma? And in that set of ideas, would we be better off by the lowering of consumption of cocaine?
It is really interesting. I'm not pretending to be an expert on cocaine.
Yeah.
I can't stand the drug. I hate the drug. In fact, I make a point of saying to any audience I speak to that anyone who uses cocaine, it has the blood of Colombian people in their hands.
Absolutely.
Alejandro, your point that it has come to light that the deliberate distortion of data on the impact and consequences of opiates by big pharma has caused this extraordinary epidemic in the United States and Canada and elsewhere. And so big pharma seems to get away with pushing opiates, and yet, if cocaine was legalized, I don't know. I don't know really what benefit. I don't know if you could really come up with a sort of a national cocaine company that would actually distribute cocaine. I think it's a very uninteresting drug, and it's a horrible drug. But the point, of course, is that the consequences of prohibition are far more severe and impact innocent people in a way that is simply unacceptable.
As a young viewer is approaching this program or listening to this show, I'd like to mention your constant love for storytelling, and I'd like you to enlighten this audience and the audiences who will be watching and listening to this podcast about the importance and the significance of storytelling in a modern world where
Well-
truth is at stake.
Well, that's a really important point. I mean, with increased power of global mass media, the impact of the internet, which we've always sort of thought was hopefully going to be a sign of freedom and independence and politicians follow, they never lead. Polemics are never persuasive, but storytellers change the world. And, one of the things that I embraced when I came out of the university system is that I really felt that the issues that I had been engaging in anthropology and biology, biological diversity, cultural diversity, it was so clear to me that these issues were far too important to just reside in the academic cocoon. And I felt that an obligation to start telling these stories. And, it's interesting. Hemingway said that, anyone who says that writing is easy is either a bad writer or a liar. And it's true, but I think that everything you write is hard, but the hard's what makes it good. But to maintain your energy through the hard, you have to have, at least I have to have a mission. And every book I've ever written has been ultimately driven by some sense of injustice. I wrote a book on voodoo, and what propelled me there was this horrible idea that when we note the great religions of the world, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, whatever, there's one whole continent left out, as if black people had no religion. Well, of course, by ethnographic definition, that was absurd. But then you begin to think, well, so where does this idea of voodoo being evil come from? Voodoo is just a fond word from Dahomey that means spirit or God. So what's going on here? Well, maybe it's the fact that Haiti was the only successful slave revolt in history. Haiti defeated the forces of Napoleon, and had they not done so, Americans would be speaking French west of the Mississippi. Simon Bolivar was funded by Haiti on the condition that he free the slaves in Gran Colombia. And then the U.S. Marine Corps occupies Haiti in the 1920s, and everybody above the rank of sergeant gets a book contract. And the books have names like Cannibal Cousins, Black Baghdad, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, The Magic Island, The White King of Laguna. All of these books are filled with voodoo dolls that don't exist, zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people, and of course, children bred for the cauldron. And they essentially gave rise to the RKO movies, Night of the Living Dead, and they said to the American people, during the era of Jim Crow and segregation, that any country where such abominations occur could only find its redemption through military occupation. So I wanted to explore, reveal that. And similarly, when I wrote about Schultes, I wanted to celebrate the wonder of this man. I mean, the incredible thing about Schultes is that he was a terrible storyteller. He had no sense of the drama of his own life. And I interviewed him for 30 hours at the beginning of that project, and those tapes put me back 6 months because none of it was really true. And well, it was true, but like, for example, he'd have some old chestnut, like, well, there I was in the Putumayo y estuvimos cocinando la cena y yo dije, fritamos el papa, yuck, 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 fritamos la papa, no, la papa, el papa, no. I said we'd fry the Pope. Okay, Professor, I've heard that 5,000 times. But then you discover that where the campfire was, esa fue la cosa, ¿no? En el medio del bosque, después que un viaje de como tantos meses, como muertos y sangre y todo eso, ¿no? And he didn't have a sense of his own drama. And so what was so beautiful about the book, in order to break up a long narrative, I inserted dialogue, both between Tim and myself and Schultes. Obviously, I no more remembered what Tim said to me in 1974, and I certainly don't know what Schultes said to somebody in 1943. But I was very careful to, using that literary device to root it in authenticity. If there was a meeting that Schultes had in Bogota, I would make sure who was there, what the agenda was, what the outcome was. But for Schultes, the beautiful thing is the book became his life. In other words, his wife said, Dorothy, that he kept the book by his bedside table until he died. And when he couldn't sleep at night, which was often, he would just open it and read of his life. And one time he took me aside and he said, Wade, You won't believe what Mrs. Bedard said to me when I met her in Bogota in 1943. Look, it's right here. And that was what I had made up. And it was so beautiful because he had made my life possible. I was able to actually give him back his life as he faded from the stage,
Right.
Literally, because he had lost all memory of where he had gone.
It's incredible.
And I was only able to reconstruct his life through primary archival documents.
What's the hardest part of doing that, of reconstructing someone else's life through?
Well, a lot of it is he didn't keep any journals. And so he took thousands of photographs, which was a treasure. So you can see the day he arrived in Bogota, he gets on a tramillo and he goes with nuns. He follows nuns up a mountain and collects his first specimen, a new species of orchid that he presses in his passport. Or the fact that in Bogota in 1941, the tallest building was the spire of the church on the Plaza Santander. It's incredible, So you could, and of course, Bogotá antes que el Bogotazo y después, totalmente distinto, no? And so the photographs allowed you to do that. And then I had his botanical collection notebooks, so I knew the date and what he had collected. So, for example, here's a good story. I knew he found the magic mushrooms in Mexico. He sparked the psychedelic era.
He did.
Oh, totally.
He did that.
Totally. Are you kidding? Schultes? Totalmente, hombre. He was the one. It was right out of Indiana Jones, you see. And what it was is he got his start. He was very conservative from a very poor family in Boston. And he couldn't even afford to stay in the dorms at Harvard. And he took a job in the economic botany library filing cards for 15 cents an hour. And he found himself surrounded by these monographs of distant tribes and accounts of poisons and strange drugs. And he took the course that had been taught that at Harvard longer than any other. And one of the things, his professor, who hated the government, so one of the laboratory assignments throughout Prohibition was to distill, ferment, and drink huge amounts of alcohol. That was a requirement of the course. But when it came to these curious plants called the Fantastica, as the hallucinogens were known then, the professor had his limits, so he had to do a book report. He races to the back of the hall, gets the smallest book he can, because he's got so much other homework, puts it in a satchel, goes home to his tenement in East Boston, and that night, botanical history was made. Because the book that he happened to have selected was the only monograph then available in the English language that described the stunning pharmacological effects of peyote. And he comes back the next day and he says to the professor, I have to know this plant. He had read all night long of visions of diamonds floating over his imagination. And so the professor said, you must know it. So he, old 1928 Studebaker with a companion, drove over the dusty roads of America to Indian country in Oklahoma in 1933 and ate peyote 5 days a week for 8 weeks. Needless to say, he came back to Boston, a boy transformed. And he goes off and makes that great discovery. But the point is that I found alive still a missionary who had been in Huautla in Oaxaca in 1936 when he went there, 38. And she said to me, there was this crazy bicycle that Jose Dorantes had. Jose Dorantes was a merchant who gave him the first specimens of mushrooms. And I wanted to find out and I knew that every night there was no electricity except a generator, one string of light bulbs, one cobbled street of Huautla, all these Mazatec kids who would chase Jose Dorantes like squirrels as he rode his bicycle every night. And I wanted to find out, I wonder if that's what Schultes saw when he arrived. So what I did is I went back to the original Trocha with his field collecting notes, and I walked as I was watching where he collected each plant. And as the topographical gradient went up on the mountain trail into Huautla, I was watching his collection, so I kept at his pace the whole time, and I arrived just at 6 o'clock in Huautla. And so then I went back to Schultes and I said, Professor, concentrate. I want you to remember what the first thing you saw when you arrived in Huautla for the first time. I didn't say anything else. He thought for a moment, he says, that goddamn bicycle. And yet, and it was red. But, that took a week and a half. And in the book, One River, it's one sentence,
It's great to have you in Bogota. Congratulations on the 4th edition. I know you'll be talking to Mr. Alfredo Molano tonight about their new upcoming book. When's that coming out?
I think it'll be out with Planeta either late of this year or early 2020. In London and New York, it'll come out in early 2020, and there'll be a shortened version as an illustrated special edition book by Savia and Argos, probably early 2020 as well.
Thank you very much for taking the time. Have a great rest of weekend here in Bogotá. Enjoy la Feria del Libro. Great meeting you.
Gracias, Alejandro.
Este programa fue financiado a través de los recursos del Fondo para el Desarrollo de la Televisión y los Contenidos de la Autoridad Nacional de Televisión.